Hi guys, Brett from Hearns Hobbies, and today I would like to take a look at, talk about and actually rebuild the shocks on this off-road 8-scale buggy. So to do that, we're going to unbolt the shocks, we're going to empty the oil, we're going to rebuild the cartridge where the O-ring is, refill, bleed and assemble the oils. Now there's a few tools that we'll be using for that, primarily the buggy. I've got some XTR shock oils that I'll be using here. Be putting 32 in the rear, 47 in the front. I'm not actually too sure exactly what's in the buggy. I think it's got 400 all around. It is a ready to run unit, but the on-track performance last time, so at least I know now exactly what's going to go in there. And don't be ashamed or don't be scared to put the wrong shock oil in. It is a tuning tool, so it's something that we use, and changing racing circles can even be a couple of times a day at the track until we get the right settings or the track changes in a way that we need different handling. What have I got here? I've got some XTR O-ring grease. I'll be using that on the O-rings and the shock cartridges, and that will protect the O-rings from the silicone oil. I've got my trusty little 9 steps toolkit here. One of the most I suppose critical tools that we'll be using today will be these soft jaw JPRC shock pliers, and they will allow me to grab the shock body and the shock shaft without causing any undue damage or stress. I've also got some Aramax shock pliers there and some 9 steps Allen drivers. Apart from that, I've got some very simple vernier calipers here, and these are for me just to measure the shock length before I start, so I know once I reassemble it I am in fact doing it to the same measurements as what they came apart, to ensure that we've got the same droop settings. Okay, so let's start by getting the shocks off of the buggy. So just as simple as start from the rear here, get the rear shocks off, get the top cap out of the way. We'll leave the bush on the shock tower. In this situation, you know, where you're doing it at home, or it might be even over a couple of nights project, you might want to put the screws back in situ so you know exactly where they come from, especially the lower ones on 8 scales for newcomers, because this buggy and many other competition buggies do in fact have reverse thread or left hand thread screws on the bottom mounts of the shocks, so they don't come loose during in the heat of competition. And this buggy here is no different either. If I turn it over here, you'll see the shock mounts. One is a silver or chrome, that is reverse thread, so I'm actually doing it up to undo it effectively. And the other thing why you put the screws or back in, I suppose, situ, is also so you know exactly where they came from, so you're not changing the settings on the arms at this point. Okay, so I won't be changing the piston specs. This will just be rebuilding the shocks, and it has had a good run. This is a ready to run unit, and I'll show you how I know that they needed to be rebuilt when we get to the front end. Apart from not handling exactly how I wanted with its on-track performance, when after a day's racing, you can actually, it's got a lot of air gap between the piston. It's got a good 10 mil at the hinge pin, and that's uncontrolled movement, and that's because there's a lack of oil inside the shock. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily leaked out, it just means the way that it's been assembled at the factory. So we'll take that out of the equation by giving a fresh rebuild with quality XTR lubricants. And it's also important to keep note, whether it's in a piece of paper on your phone or something, exactly what's going in there for either next time when you rebuild it, or in fact if you want to go heavier and lighter in oil, you actually know what's in there when you're changing it. Generally these buggies will have a difference in the front to rear ratio, again completely dependent on the piston specifications inside as well, as that's also fully adjustable. But we're just going here for a fairly generic starting point. Okay, the lower mounts are off. We'll flip it on over, get these top mounts off, and then the buggy can actually go out of the way. We won't need that until we put the shocks back on. Leave the shock bush there. Put the buggy to the side. Now you'll notice as well the buggy is nice and clean, so if it is dirty you will definitely want to, or you're doing it trackside, definitely give the shocks a good clean as you're going, because the last thing you want to do is introduce more contaminants into your freshly rebuilt damper units. Okay, give ourselves a fresh bit of tool. Got ourselves a shock stand here. Now the shock stand is really helpful because you can put front and rear, left to right, all on there. This one here is nothing too critical. You can see the air gap in the front unit. That's what, when we rebuilt this, that will be completely eliminated. The rear one, not quite as bad on this side. This one, yeah, even worse. So that's exactly what we're going to eliminate. So we'll start by taking the springs off, putting them to the side. Front and rear springs will usually be different lengths. In this case they're very different, so you won't be able to really get them confused. It is important though to pay attention to the spring retainers, because they can sometimes be different front to rear. And this is when you want to be noticing, not when you're assembling it. These ones here are exactly the same, so they can just, all these spares can go to one side, knowing that I won't in fact be messing up any of the parts. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is remove the shock boot off the shock, and I'm going to measure the front length of the shock. The length of the front shock, I should say. So here I've got the vernier, and that is bang on 33 millimeters. So that's nice and easy to remember. 33 millimeters on the front, and on the rear unit, being longer, we have 42. It's 41.8, but we'll just call it 42 when we reassemble it. So I'll reassemble it with 42. It's going to increase the droop ever so slightly, but it'll give us a nice round number and starting point. 33 and 42. Okay, another thing to take into account now is also if the lower mount is of different lengths, and in this case they're not either. So we can go ahead now, grab our soft jaw pliers, and we'll take our lower shock mount off. Just going to grip it nice and tight. And you, like I said, you really need to make sure that you are using soft jaw pliers, because if you use a steel jaw, normal pliers or pointy nose pliers, you will damage the shock shaft, and that will lead to damage, burrs on the shock shaft, and damage the O-rings, causing them to leak. Okay, now the front parts I'll put over here. So we'll do the front ones first, and that way they'll all be to one side. Like so. Now this isn't just changing the oils, this is going to be a complete rebuild where we lubricate the O-rings. Can conveniently put the shocks in the car stand there, get the rear ones like so. And you'll see how many turns of thread there are here. That's exactly why I measured the shocks beforehand, so I know that they'll be going together the same length, because that will be altering the droop settings on the suspension arms with the potential up travel, which can change the handling characteristics. unwind that, get the boot off. And like I said, if you do have any dirt and debris, now's the time to clean it before we actually open the shock body. We don't need to take note too much of the ride height because that'll be something that's adjustable and can change anyway. So that's really good. And what we can do now is loosen off the shock caps. Again, using soft jaw pliers is ensuring that I'm not damaging any of the hard anodizing, both aesthetically and causing burrs and damage on there. Here we go. Okay, so I've got the lower one loosened. The reason I've loosened the lower one is to take any preload off of the O-rings. We'll loosen that up because I am going to be running this threaded section through, so I want to make sure that we're not causing any damage there. I might even go as far as lubricating it up at the time, but for now let's open the cap and see what we're greeted with. So inside here we've got a bladder, and I can tell by looking at the oil, you can zoom right in there, that it is in fact pretty clean, which is good. Like I said, the Buggy from brand new has only had about 5 batteries, so I wouldn't expect it to be really dirty at this point. But nonetheless, we will empty it out. A silicone oil, so be thoughtful of where you dispose it. This one here is just going to go in an old coffee cup, like so. I'll get a bit of the shock oil on my finger. I'm going to put it on the threads, and then I will run that through the O-rings, pull it out nice and gently. I'll put that to the side, and you can see why it's so important to have a clean working area, so you're not in fact introducing any contaminants into the shock body. And what we're looking at here, I'm looking at closely at the shock body, moving it around, see if there's any wear in the bore from the piston, or if there's anything loose been in there. You know, even a bit of metal swarf or something from machining will be in there, and that can cause all sorts of havoc with your shock body. Then I'll go ahead and loosen the lower cap, like so. And I've got my plastic gizmo tool here. It's always good to use something plastic or soft, and take the cartridge apart. So we've got a bush, we've got a guide, we've got an O-ring, we've got another guide and an O-ring, and that's a very familiar setup. Good. So what we need to do now is get a nice clean cloth and give it a wipe over, ready for reassembly. Now I did mention using O-ring grease before, and I talked about packing the cartridge, and this is exactly how we'll do it. So we'll wipe the O-rings over, get all the oil off, because silicone oil and silicone O-rings don't actually mix. The silicone O-ring will in fact slowly over time absorb the silicone oil, causing them to swell and cause undue friction in your shock absorber package. So we'll clean off all the oil, get my O-ring grease here, and obviously that's rubber safe. As simple as throwing the O-ring into the grease. We'll move it on around, make sure that it's liberally coated, and back into the shock body itself, like so. Put the bush in, next O-ring, giving it a good application of the grease. Also helps in creating a nice seal. Put the guide in, leaving the lower cap to be assembled back on. Now I don't want to do it up tight at this point because it will be crushing or preloading the O-rings, so I want that left as loose as possible for when we put the shock shaft through with its rough thread. It's at this point too that we can wipe over the shock shaft, and we'll check the piston to make sure it's tight and not too tight that it's seized like it seems to be. No, it's actually good, perfect, no movement. And I can see here that we have got and it's handy that they've written it on there, we have got a 5-hole piston. I can zoom up really close there. A 5-hole piston, and it's engraved with 1.3. So it's a 5 by 1.3 piston in the front. So that's a handy piece of info to put in our setup sheet. And just put a little bit of grease on that thread, making that. Now the reason these shock shafts are actually black is that's a special coating on there, special, like a ceramic coating, I'll say. Really cool, referred to as DLC, diamond light coating, used in full scale shock absorber units too. So we'll put that through nice and gently. We'll get the excess grease off. I can push the piston all the way down and exactly reverse. So we'll put on the shock boot. This is a rear one, so it's a longer one. How many times I've reassembled 8th scale buggy shocks and forgotten the shock boot. And we'll go ahead and tighten up the lower shock mount. Okay. Now it's time for me to tighten up the lower cartridge, and it shouldn't be excessively tight. The only reason I'm using the pliers is so I can feel that I'm not actually crushing it, doing it up with my hand, and I'm feeling for any undue. So you want the cartridge nice and tight, but not causing any undue friction on that assembly, which it's not. Lovely. So go ahead now, that is tightened. Oops, sorry. What we'll do now is get the correct length. So we know the rear one has to be 42 millimeters, and that's where we'll measure it with the verniers. We've managed to get exactly the same as before, 41.8, so I'm just going to back it off half a turn, like so. We'll re-measure it. The magic number that we're looking for is 42, and that's exactly what we've got on our vernier calipers. Great. We can put the boot on, and at this point I'll usually put the lower spring mount on. When I'm bleeding my shocks, I usually leave that on to make sure that we're bleeding it correctly. Okay, that is one unit done. So what I will then do, that's a rear one, and I know that we are in fact going to put 32.5 weight in there, so I'll go ahead and fill it up and it can start bleeding. So bit of a secret with the, oh not secret, but a little tip with the off-road shocks is probably halfway compress the shock shaft. We can put some oil in. Majority of it will sit above the piston, but what this will do will make it hopefully bleed out in one big air bubble, like so. Filling up, pulling the piston all the way down to the bottom, filling the shock up to the top, and then we will slowly bleed the shock, just going through the range of motion, just nice and smooth. And hopefully by doing that way, we haven't created like champagne bubbles in the oil. So what we want to try and achieve is no air in the shock. Fantastic, and that looks really nice and smooth. Being a lighter weight 32, the air will rise to the top naturally. Just moving it up once or twice, making sure there's no air trapped under the piston. And we can in fact put that to the side. Just going to take this lower spring retainer off so I can sit it on the stand. There we go. That way it can't fall over. Now it's as simple as going over that the other 3 times. Next one I'll do a front one. So I won't do all of them today. So I've got my shock cap here actually. I'll take the bladder out because I want to clean it. And looking at these bladders is they are really nice reinforced bladders, what we're looking at here in these buggy shocks, so they won't just collapse. Really nice shock unit actually, especially for a high quality ready to run unit that it is. Okay, put the 32 to the side. Now let's have a look at a front unit. Now we know the rear one had a 5 by 1.3 piston. Let's see if they've gone for the same piston in this unit. Just loosening off the lower mount. This lower mount seems to be a bit tighter than the other one. Again, using 2 pliers. Get that cartridge nice and loose, give it a little bit of a wiggle, take all the preload off. We'll go ahead and get this top cap off. Get the oil out. There we go. We'll get this cartridge out of the way. It's really nice. These little trips of rebuilding the lower cartridge at this point is the difference between just having a shock package and having a good shock package. Nice, consistent, will last you a good day or two's racing and make the seals last a long time. Keeping the oil clean and keeping the cartridge lubed up is a great way to extend the life of your and performance of your components. Okay, O-ring into the O-ring grease. Got my bush. Again, using the plastic tool here, the gizmo, that does ensure that I'm not causing any damage or nicking the alloy bodies or the rubber O-rings. Getting it in to sit nice. Put the bush in there and the lower cap. Make it all sit together. Okay, set that body to the side. Have a look at this front one. Let's see if they've gone for the 5 by 1.3. They have indeed got a 5-hole by 1.3 piston, so it's good that they've got same front and rear. And knowing what's in there now that I know the oil in there, we'll really be able to identify which way we go with the setup in the future to give different performance and handling characteristics. Okay, got a front shock here, so we'll put the front boot on. Lower shock mount and the measurement we'll go for here was 33. Again with the shock pliers, winding it up. Then we'll preload the bottom cartridge. Really great unit. Lovely. Nice and firm with no binding. You can go ahead and measure a shock length. We are at, this one has to go probably tighter, another turn or half a turn. Get it to the 23 mark. Sorry, 33. A little bit more. Like I said, it's these little touches are not absolutely necessary, but they will give you a much better result. 33 on the money. Again, put the shock halfway up the, the piston halfway up the shock body. Go ahead here in the front, putting 47.5 XTR oil. Halfway up, you can see the air coming through. Pull it down in one motion, then we'll refill it. Hopefully not creating champagne bubble effect in the oil, so we can bleed it out faster with a better result. A little bit overfilled. Here we go. Just wiping it off as I'm going. Full extension. Beautiful. Now while this one sits for a minute, we'll be able to go to the rear one that we just did earlier, and we'll be able to finish the bleeding process. I can put this to the side. So, the way I like to bleed my 8 scale buggy shocks is we'll put the spring retainer on the bottom. I will put the bladder in the top, sliding it in the side. Now this is going to get a bit messy because I do expect to bleed excess oil out. So I'm going to hold it in there with my finger that you can see here. I'm going to push the shock body up all the way. All the excess oil will come out. Just going to hold the rag around. You can see the excess oil coming out here, just until I feel the piston hit my finger under the bladder, which it is. Have to squeeze quite tight. Meanwhile, holding the bladder in, give it a wipe. Now I'm holding it compressed with one hand, holding it. I'm going to let that bladder sit there and go ahead now and tighten up the cap. Go backwards until it clicks. Such a fine thread on these. Holding it compressed. We'll give it a wipe over all this mess and we'll see how we go. So we don't want the shock to suck back in, make it shorter, and we don't want it to have rebound. So I'm trying to build referred to as a dead shock or dead damper unit with no rebound in the unit itself. So we can see there that we have got the smallest amount of rebound in the unit. So I'm just going to re-bleed it. So which will be as simple as holding the unit compressed, loosening off the top body about 2 turns and tightening it back down while I'm holding it, like so. And this time we've got it. So you can see here that we have a tiny bit, and that is just the boot. That's not actually rebound. That is just me over compressing the boot. I'll take that. Is perfect. That is not moving one little bit. It's not sucking in, and if we move it, there's no sound of air in there. So if I hold it upside down now, before I could move the arm, there is no movement of the piston in air. So we've completely got all the air out of that damper unit. Good. So we can go ahead and put the spring on. And we'll call that one done. One rear shocker unit done. Just need to tighten up the body. Should have done that before, so I'm just going to put the spring down. Again, you don't want to crush it, but you just want to nip it up to make sure that it can't in fact rattle loose. Like so. That will be plenty. And that is a perfect way to build your damper unit. Now let's have a look at the front one. Do exactly the same. I'll get the diaphragm out, the bladder out, give it a wipe over. Like so. Again, using the plastic tool to make sure that I'm not cutting it or damaging it at all. Wipe inside the cap. Beautifully machined alloy cap on this. Give the oil a quick. Perfect. You can see there's no air bubbles in there. Always good to overfill it a little bit. This is the front one, so it's got the 47.5 with the 5-hole 1.3mm piston in there. Give it a wipe over. We'll go ahead now and bleed it. Again, compress the shock till I can feel the nut hitting the bladder, which it is, my little finger. Hold the unit down and do the cap up. Unscrew it to hear it click, then start to do it up. Here's a little bit of a messy job doing shocks, but something that's guaranteed to improve your performance on track. With fresh units, it will jump better, it will land better, and ultimately handle better. Now we can check over the rebound, like so. Not sucking back. So it's got a little bit of rebound in there, so I just need to get a little bit more oil out. So I'm just going to compress it down, crack the cap off and do the cap back up. You can hear the oil come out, a little bit of air. Lovely. Do the cap back up. So it doesn't have to be crazy tight. Just to ensure it doesn't rattle loose on track. Bit of a wipe over. Let's check it over. Beautiful. So we can see here that we've got no rebound. It's just a little bit of the rubber squishing there from the boot. Got no suction, and we've got no air in there. Beautiful silent operation. Exactly what we want. Put the spring on and call this one done. So that is the basis of doing one front and one rear. I'll get the other ones done and we'll bolt them on the car. Okay, so as the last shock absorber unit comes together, beautifully so, we've got 2 front ones and 2 rear ones all assembled. The front ones of course having 47.5 and the rear ones now with 32.5 XTR oils. So we can pack all our messy stuff away. Get that out of the side there. And we can offer the buggy up and put the damper units back on the buggy. Give ourselves a wipe off. There we go. Okay, buggy ready for assembly. Go. Simple as putting the units back on exactly where they came from, and I just want to demonstrate to you now the difference. Remember before when we started we had that nasty air gap, so now we really shouldn't have any to little to no air gap if I've done a good job. Put this top shock cap in. Such a great unit, these buggies. Now just making sure of course that we are going into the same suspension positions. Now we are on the inner hole in the arms, closest to the center line. Probably why the factory gets away with the pistons that they do. 5 by 1.3 on our outdoor Australian tracks is typically quite a lot of pack or pressure within the shock. So generally we will run a 5 or 6 hole piston, but with a hole diameter size of 1.5 or 1.6. So with it mounted on a closer hole to the center point, we'll slow the piston speed down, lowering the velocity of the piston within the oil chamber itself. So, but at least now we know we have a starting point of 32.5 in the back, 47.5 in the front. Generally we'll always run a heavier oil in the front like that because these buggies being four-wheel drive are so heavy and can brake so hard. So there's a lot of load transfer over the front axle or towards the front of the car. And also because we're jumping them, so we're going to run them up these sometimes what seems like impossible 45-degree jumping ramps or kickers. So it's got to be able to drive up there without just burying the nose into the jump, causing inconsistent jumping. And then you've got the other side, of course, which is landing. So you want it to land quite nice, as well as the unit has to keep the tyre in contact with the ground itself while it's going over all these ruts, bumps and cornering and braking forces, as well as accelerating and wheel stands if I'm behind the wheel butchering the throttle inputs. Okay. No discernible wear or damage on the top shock mounts or the bushes. They do have this beautiful composite plastic bush here on the top mount, which allows you to do it up nice and tight while having a really good movement. There's no drag there at all and very little in the way of slop and free play. Get this lower mount done up for you guys, and we'll check that air gap on the bottom that we started with and hopefully it's drastically less. Then all we got to do is take it to the track, burn some rubber and kick up some dirt. And if you did this to your, oops, it's a reverse thread one, so left hand thread. If you did this to your buggy once every 10 batteries or so, you would notice a marked difference in performance. There we go. So they are all bolted up. And I'll tell you now, that feels a heck of a lot different statically than what we had in there. So hopefully we've got more control. It's definitely heavier damping than what was in there, but they were also half empty. So we were working with half air, half oil. And now, have a look at that. We have got oil the whole length of the movement. There is no free play in there at all, which is exactly what we want to see. There is no free play in there whatsoever. Good. Nice rebuilt shocks on this 8-scale buggy. Can't wait to get it to the track, and I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial. I'm Brett from Hearns, and you've just watched me rebuild the shocks on the 8-scale off-roader.